additional occupants in exchange for meeting certain additional requirements, end quote, mostly pertaining to property upkeep. Mr. Beato suggests instituting, quote, a formula for house capacity based on what the house can safely contain, unquote, using certain specific measurements of the house and instituting, quote, a statutory trial period in certain neighborhoods, unquote. Mr. Granger accedes that, quote, a standard of rules for exceptions could be developed, unquote, and Mr. Wheel proposes reviewing previous studies on the matter to, quote, consider increasing the limit to 4 persons where logical, unquote, based on various criteria about the house and parking around it.
The first question goes to Ms. Knutson. Despite saying that while on the Board of Zoning Appeals, you recognize several houses that might have been appropriate for more than 3 unrelated people, and that, quote, the city should work on some variances for such properties on a case-by-case basis, end quote, you were the only candidate to, in your questionnaire, in response to the question, do you believe that the 3-person do-a-house rule is successful policy for Williamsburg, respond by saying yes, with no qualifiers, such as Mr. Hallman, who said that the rule, quote, generally has been one that worked, or Mr. Freiling, who acknowledged that, quote, the rule has been helpful in some ways, but in other ways it has created challenges. How do you square your stance that the 3-person do-a-house rule has been unequivocally successful for the city, while you also acknowledge that that it has failed to provide residential occupancy limits for at least some of the properties you have dealt with?
I would take exception to the second part of that question. The first part, I believe that the 3-person rule has protected the college as much as it has helped the city. I do not think it will do the college any good to be surrounded by boarding houses, which is what will happen. The other question you all asked was, if a house is a certain size, should we do something about the 3-person rule? And the answer to that is no. It has nothing to do with the size. It has to do where the house is located. The Board of Zoning Appeals can, in fact, make a special exception. What happened to the cases that came to the Board of Zoning Appeals when I was on them is that there were complaints. The house was already occupied, and there were complaints. If the owner of the house had come to us before the house was occupied and said, I want a special exception, and this is the reason. The house is large, there's plenty of parking, it's not near other residential property. We have 6 stated criteria here that we can use to make a special exception. But instead, the owner presented us with essentially a fait accompli, which said, there are people in this house already, and you better let them stay. I would rather start from the beginning and say, this is a house that might work, and this is what we're going to do to make it work.
Thank you.
Would anyone like to respond to that?
Okay. Well, the following question is actually a follow-up from Ms. Knutson, who has served as the chair of Williamsburg's Board of Zoning Appeals. On September 5th, 2006, in your role in the BZA, you heard a special use permit request, BZA number 06-009. The request was filed by Pat Palfrey, father of current college senior Patrick Palfrey. The Palfreys owned a house on Scotland Street with more than 3 bedrooms and wanted to rent the house to more than 3 other students. The house had never had a noise complaint against it. It was owner-occupied and not just rented like the majority of houses with college students. It wasn't in the middle of a single-family residential district either. The house had a private driveway large enough that it would have kept any extra cars off the street. The family had purchased it from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and invested $45,000 in renovations to make it a livable household. 6 students had been living in the house for several months with no problems whatsoever. Ms. Knutson, after the close of public comment, you motioned to deny the request, citing your belief that granting this request would have set a precedent. The rest of the BZA followed suit and denied the request 5-0. With no concern cited about parking, safety, house maintenance, absentee landlords, or noise, why didn't you consider this property to be a prime example of a place that not only deserves to be looked at and evaluated on a case-by-case basis, but should be rewarded for representing everything year-long residents seem to want in a student-occupied house? And if not this house, what sort of characteristics of houses are you referring to that came before you on the BZA that would have been appropriate?
This is the house I was talking about before. If the owner had come to us before the house was occupied and asked for the special exception, he probably would have gotten it. Since he came, there was a complaint. They came, it was already occupied, and that's what happened.
Okay, so if students or if anyone comes before the city council prior, would you be before the BZA? That would be the acceptable option?
I'm sorry.
So you think so as your stance on the three-person house rule, if they would come before with an application process prior before they move in, you would support that?
I think if the owner of that house had come to the BZA before it was occupied and said, these are my plans for this house, it's got parking, it's got the kinds of things, I think the BZA would have taken a very different look at it. The fact that it was already occupied and there was a complaint. And in fact, there has been a second complaint about that very same house. So that's when we set up these unnecessary confrontations. It doesn't have to be like that if you follow the process.
I might jump. If I could jump in. I mean, it seems to me that because this definition is in a zoning ordinance, but there are ways that you can create opportunities within that. We do it for B&Bs. We have a list of criteria, and if your business meets those criteria, you can run a B&B in certain areas of the city. It seems to me that this isn't a special use permit. It's a permit process.
Did someone else want to start?
Yes, I will.
Can I just clarify something?
Wait, hold on. Mr. Holly, you're still...
I thought we... So it seems to me a mechanism is there, and I don't think it's probably fair to the BZA to put the responsibility for this decision on a body like the BZA. It seems to me it should be dealt with up front by City Council in the way we create within the ordinance a permitting process, and I think the model of B&B process is a very good model for us to look at.
Can I just clarify one thing that you said? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. You said that B&Bs could operate in certain areas if they met these criteria. I think what you meant was that we had a limit on the number of rooms that a B&B can have across the board. If they meet certain criteria, they get flexibility on the number of rooms that they can rent within that B&B. And so it's not just the ability to operate, but the ability to expand their operation.
Can I address this issue as well? I was at that BZA meeting that you're talking about, and I remember Brett Phillips, who was the chair of the Public Affairs Committee at that time, read a statement, and he's not someone who's extreme at all. He's quite moderate, and he was very dismayed at what happened there, because the main thing there was talking about not establishing a precedent of making exceptions. That was the main thing that they talked about at that meeting, at least according to my recognition and according to the Flathead article about it that I read before this meeting. What concerns me is that what we need to do is create a culture of making sure that there are exceptions to this rule where it makes sense. So if a house like this one has more than 3 bedrooms, has adequate parking, all of those things, the culture should be, okay, let's look at making exception. Not, let's look at not creating a precedent against breaking the house because there'll be a slippery slope. There will be a slippery slope because the people on council won't let that happen, and I'm very confident of that, and I won't let that happen either. But I do think there should be some exceptions to this rule.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, Mr. Wheel, and then...
Yes, please. I think we do need clarity, though. I'm a little uncomfortable with trying to get special exceptions. The house next door to mine is a 4-bedroom house, and then it has a detached 500-square-foot servants' quarters. Well, they can only have 2 people in the 4-bedroom house and 1 person in the servants' quarters, and that's obviously illogical to me. So I think a home like that, and with clear definitions, that would be the way to go on the 4-person rule. Also, I'd like to recommend that we have allow 2 on-street parking permits per house. That would solve a lot of the fears about the parking issue. And I think all of this is involved with the boogeyman of parties and noise and what's going to happen if we allow too many people in the house. And I think we can deal with that in other ways. Thank you.
Well, 2 things. I was actually knocking on doors on Mr. Wheel's street yesterday, and there was no place to park on your street. There were cars everywhere. What Mr. Beato said about precedent, the precedent was that the students were already in the house. And that's what the precedent is. If you don't follow the procedure at the beginning and do it right and say, okay, these kids are already here, and